Welcome, and thank you for joining today's conference, 2020 State of the Science Report. Before we begin, please ensure you have opened the WebEx participant and chat panels by using the associated icons located at the bottom of your screen. Please note that all audio connections are muted at this time. You may submit written questions throughout the presentation, and these will be addressed during the Q&A. To submit a written question, select all panelists from the drop-down menu in the chat panel, enter your question in the message box provided, and send. If you require technical assistance, please send a chat to ES Studio. With that, I'll turn the conference over to Andrea Copping, Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. Please go ahead.
Thanks very much. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to thank you very much for joining us here today. My name is Andrea Copping. I'm a senior research scientist at Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, and my co-author here today, Lynette Hemery, is also a scientist at PNNL. But we are representing Ocean Energy Systems Environmental Initiative. And what we will be doing over the next hour or so is talking about the 2020 State of the Science Report on environmental effects of marine renewable energy around the world. This report was released on Monday, on June 8th for World Oceans Day, and it is available online, both as a full document and chapter by chapter, and I hope you will go and take advantage of looking at that. I'm going to throw a few acronyms around today just to be clear. OES stands for Ocean Energy Systems, and I will refer to marine renewable energy as MRE. Try to keep it to that. So what I'd like to do is just give a little bit of background on OES and what we're doing here, and then really dive into the report. It'll still be a pretty high-level look. Oh my, now let's change the slide. There we go. All righty, so Ocean Energy Systems is a group of countries, 25 at the moment, under the International Energy Agency, who have come together with an interest in developing marine renewable energy around the world. And OES-Environmental is a task under OES with the purpose of examining environmental effects. Until last August, this task was known as Annex IV, so that might ring a bell with some of you. The reason that these countries have come together to look at environmental effects is very much focused on how do environmental effects, potential environmental effects, so excuse me, I got to pause for one moment. I think some of you may be missing the international call-in number, and so we'll get that put into the chat box for you. Okay, the reason that for looking at environmental effects of MRE around the world is to try to understand what the effects might be for responsible development. And so we're really very focused on how do we move forward with this low-carbon energy source without doing damage in the ocean. And under OES-Environmental, the purpose is to provide information for efficient government oversight for development, to ensure that any existing data and information are made widely accessible, and to proactively facilitate this knowledge transfer. We've been doing this under OES-Environmental for about 10 years now, starting in 2010. For the first 3 years, our first phase, that culminated in 2013 in a preliminary report looking at some interactions in the ocean with marine renewable energy. The second phase, also 3 years, ran through 2016, and at the end of that phase, the first State of the Science report was produced. You see the little cover there. And we are just finishing up phase 3, which was a 4-year phase through 2020 with the culmination of this report. We have applied to Ocean Energy Systems International, Ocean Energy Systems for a 4th phase, and that is pending. Through this 3rd phase, there have been 15 nations participating from Europe, Africa, North America, Asia, and Australia. So what about the report itself? What it does is it summarizes the major stressor-receptor interactions, and we use this sort of construct of stressors and receptors after Bullitt and Gill from 2010 paper, where stressors are those parts of an MRE device or system that could cause stress, injury, or damage to marine animals or habitats. And the receptors are those marine animals and habitats. So it's those interactions we're interested in and how they might affect moving forward with consenting or permitting. We've also, in this report, examined environmental monitoring technologies and techniques, and we've got a series of management and planning measures that should help to move some of the science we have forward towards consenting. This report was developed by 30 authors from 4 countries, and it's been extensively reviewed by experts. You can see there 11 countries. A lot of scientists and engineers have taken a look, and we have responded to over 1,900 comments from the initial release that came out in January. This report serves as an update and also a complement to the 2016 State of the Science report. Came out last Monday, as I said. And we consider this a public draft, so it's still open for comment, and the final will be released in September. Okay, I mentioned this stressor-receptor relationship. We have, over the last 10 years, really kind of honed this down to 7 stressors that are of importance in moving forward. One is collision risk. That is the risk of animals running into moving parts of turbines. Underwater noise from operational devices and how it could affect animals. Electromagnetic fields largely given off from power export cables and how it may affect biota. Changes in habitat on both the seafloor and in the water column. Changes in oceanographic systems, that is, changes in flow and circulation and wave height. The potential for large marine animals to become entrapped or entangled in mooring lines and cables. And the last one, displacement, which I'm not going to talk any more about today, but this is a stressor we think we need to keep our eyes on. The concept being that if you had many wave or tidal or other devices out in the ocean, this could prove to be a displacement or even act as a barrier effect of animals moving to their preferred habitats, in particular for migratory species. But we really can't get much insight into this potential stressor because we simply don't have the devices out there to look at. But this is one we'll be keeping an eye on in the future. So the actual State of the Science report, it is an over 300-page report, so it's a bit much to digest. It's divided into 5 sections, an introductory section with some background and laying out some of the questions. Section B really gets into these stressor-receptor relationships. Section C deals with environmental monitoring approaches and techniques. Section D looks at these management and planning methods for accelerating consenting or permitting. And Section D is sort of the wrap-up, looking ahead, and a summary. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go through each of these chapters and give you some of the highlights, and that's all they are, the highlights. So if we start with Chapter 1, this is really talking about marine renewables and ocean energy systems, introducing it. The highlights really are a discussion of what Ocean Energy Systems, OES, does, and some of the activities that have taken place under OES-Environmental over the last few years. And although much of the report really tries to look at potential effects, we also want to reflect on the benefits of marine renewable energy development. Obviously, with a low energy or low carbon source, climate change mitigation is very important, but also the potential economic development and jobs that can be placed, particularly in areas without other types of industry in fairly remote parts of the world, quite honestly, is a real benefit. And in addition to the potential for providing grid scale or utility power, there is also the potential for powering a number of small end uses. In the U.S., we've referred to this as powering the blue economy, aquaculture, ocean observations, remote communities, and so on. So we see marine renewables can really play this role. But probably the largest caveat that could come out of this entire report is how important it is to cite carefully, find the right places to put these in, obviously with sufficient marine resource for energy, but also being able to avoid the most sensitive areas and do this in a responsible manner. So the table here is just to let you know that in addition to this large 300-page report, which we really are highlighting and aiming at the research community, the science-based regulatory community, it is downloadable as the whole report and individual chapters. There is also supplementary material up online. You'll find on the same page on Tethys. Again, very much on the science end of it. This was material that was simply too much for the big book, and I think provides some extra depth for those that want to delve into it. There is a 12-page executive summary of the report that we really think is very suitable for interested stakeholders, the industry, regulators, and so on. It's part of the main report, but it's also standalone. It's currently up there in English, but it will be translated into the multiple languages that reflect the OES-Environmental countries shortly. And finally, there are a series of 13 what we call short science summaries. These are two-page, well-illustrated, quick looks at much of the information that is there. And these we think are most useful for the interested public and perhaps the policy level of agencies. So I would really recommend when you have a chance to go look at the report, but look at some of these other pieces as well. Okay, moving to Chapter 2. This is where we've really laid out sort of defining stressors and receptors, what do we mean by environmental effects, and some of the question-driven approach. This allows us to look at the context in which we measure risk to animals and habitats. We talk about the stressors and receptors, and a key piece here really is about the importance of scale. As an example, when we get to thinking about mooring lines and potential entrapment or entanglement of whales, you need to look at the size of the mooring lines versus the whales, et cetera. And we also lay out that the research and monitoring done to date in this field really is addressing two different types of questions. One is the mechanisms for possible harm, and these are fairly ubiquitous. They can probably be studied in one place, and the knowledge can really be used elsewhere. For example, how do animals potentially interact with and perhaps collide with turbine blades? What are the effects of noise on groups of species, et cetera? The other set of questions really deal with the context for that risk. For example, if you have a tidal turbine at depth, what is the density of the animals of concern at that depth who could be at risk? If you were to go into a new site, what is the presence of species in the area, particularly those considered at risk because they have protected status, perhaps their populations are depleted, et cetera. So it is these two sets of information that really have moved us forward so far. Okay, moving into the meatier chapters, and Chapter 3 is about collision risk around turbines. This is probably the largest, meatiest chapter because this continues to be one of the risks of real concern. This focuses on collision risk around turbines for marine mammals, fish, and diving seabirds, both in tidal areas but also the turbines that are used in large rivers. The quick highlights are we still have not got very many observations of animals right around turbines. It's difficult to do because of the murky and sometimes very fast-moving waters. And it's also very interesting, country by country, there are different values placed on some of these animals. For instance, marine mammals and diving seabirds come up as the most important if you're working in Scotland. Fish become of greater importance in the U.S., Canada, Japan, and Wales. So the emphasis of the research community and often the monitoring differs country by country. We look at a lot of different models of collision risk. They are still not as good as they could be, but they've improved substantially in the last few years. But generally, we don't have field data to validate them, so that's still a real need. So what you see on the right-hand side here is this little sort of odometer dial with colors, and you'll see these in subsequent slides. This is our take of where this risk still is. And this is, for collision, it's still perceived to be quite a high risk for two reasons. There is a great deal of uncertainty about whether collisions will occur. What is the probability of a collision? And then there's also a lot of uncertainty. If a collision occurred with an animal, what would the consequence be? Would it be death? Would it be serious injury or recoverable? And this, again, varies by species, location, et cetera. And underneath that odometer dial, you see 4 bars. And this is, again, sort of a quick take of what do we need to do to try to better understand this risk, perhaps lower that dial to a lower risk and by decreasing uncertainties. The top one, and again, you'll see these over and over. The first one is we need to increase our sharing of the existing information. Make sure everybody in this field, regulators, developers, researchers, have a grasp of what all is really known. We need to continue to improve our modeling of these interactions, and we definitely need more monitoring data to verify the findings and the models. And there's still new research needed, so those are all considered sort of high priorities for trying to understand and reduce this risk. Okay, moving on. The next chapter deals with risk from underwater noise, and here we're talking about operational noise from turbines and wave energy converters, or WECs. We're not talking about pile driving, because that's really something that is not done much in the marine renewables field, and we know a great deal about how pile driving noise can affect animals from other industries. Oh, I wanted to note, I didn't in the previous slides, the author chapters are listed on each slide. So those are, this is definitely not all our own work. So the highlights from Chapter 4, the risk from underwater noise. We really still don't know at what sound levels physical harm is likely to be done. That is the type of thing from pile driving, but we do not believe that there is this physical harm likely from the operational noise. So the more likely effects are going to be behavioral, of animals taking note and either avoiding or being attracted to a turbine or a WEC because of the sound. But behavioral effects are really difficult to study. They're costly, and in these high-energy waters, they're particularly difficult. But we have some really important tools that have come online not that long ago. One is an international standard through the International Electrotechnical Commission, known as TC-114, specific to marine renewables, and there is a specification for measuring noise from turbines and operational wave devices. In addition, in the U.S., we have some regulatory action levels or standards for underwater noise for marine mammals, which have been developed by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and we have some guidance for underwater sound from operational underwater sound for fish by the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. Now, these are for the U.S., but we haven't found equivalent in other countries, and it at least gives us a benchmark. So far, for those turbines and wave energy converters that have been measured, they fall below these guidelines. However, there's still work to be done to be sure that we look at new types of turbines and WECs as they come online in new locations. And for that reason, this is still considered not a low risk, but not as high as collision risk. And you see the dial there in sort of the yellow to light green. The point being risk is high at red or orange and low at green. And again, you see those bars where we need to continue to share our existing information. They're not quite as long as they were for collision risk. We need to improve our modeling, and we definitely need monitoring data to verify our findings and still some new research to further understand this risk. Moving to Chapter 5, written out of Wales by Andrew Gill and Marieke Desender. This is looking at the effects of electromagnetic fields produced by export power cables from marine renewable devices taking the power to shore. Largely, there are also other cables and effects in the EMF sources in the environment, and particularly looking at certain sensitive species. Now, it's important to note there are only certain marine species that have the sensory capability to recognize electric and magnetic fields. And they tend to be certain elasmobranchs, the bony fish, like certain species of sharks and rays and skates. There are certain of the mobile crustaceans, like crab and lobster, we know receive these signals. We know, and we have some concept that certain fish and sea turtles do because of the way they navigate. But there's really not a lot known about many of these animals' capabilities. A lot of what we know is from lab and field studies, and we see that animals' behavior often will change, in the ones that are able, around a source of EMF, crossing a cable, around some kind of other large source. But they seem to be fairly small effects. The animals may notice but move on to their regular habitats and their regular behaviors. However, at the moment, we don't have many devices in the water, and we don't have a lot of energy being carried from marine renewable energy devices. So this is something we're probably going to have to revisit as we get to larger arrays. We don't have thresholds or standardized methods for measurement, unfortunately, but based on the laboratory studies, the field studies that have been done, and also the amount of power being covered, moved, we do not believe that this is a very high risk. So you see that reflected as a somewhat green risk. And we do think that sharing existing information, improving our modeling, and collecting monitoring data are the most important ways forward. There is some new research needed, but not to the same extent as noise or collision risk. The next chapter deals with changes in benthic and pelagic habitats. How are these devices likely to change these habitats, and of course from there perhaps have effects on the animals. Lene Kemery was the author. Here we really can draw from a lot of other offshore industries. There's not a lot of difference of putting down an anchor or a mooring line for, say, a navigation buoy, what goes on with oil and gas rigs offshore that are anchored or otherwise placed on the bottom. There are other kinds of development that we can really learn from. So the real bottom line here is we need to cite our MRE projects carefully to avoid rare or unusual or fragile habitats. And once we do that, we probably can consider this a pretty low risk. In addition to putting foundations and anchors and so on the bottom and changing that footprint of benthic habitat, we will have mooring lines through the water column for floating tidal and many wave devices, and often buoys on the surface. And these will attract fish. They will also allow for settling of benthic organisms. We call that biofouling as humans, and we don't like it around our devices because it can cause additional maintenance and cleaning needs. It can foul various parts of the devices. But this is not, generally speaking, an environmental issue, environmental effect. The fish who will come and reef around devices, certain species will come and sit around anything in the ocean, but there really doesn't appear to be a mechanism of harm that will come from this reefing. So for that reason, it's considered a low risk. And we consider the most important way forward is to share what information we have. Additional modeling and monitoring data are needed to verify these findings, but generally we consider this a reasonably low risk. As we look at changes in oceanographic systems, here we look at how putting marine renewable energy devices in can change flow, remove energy from an ecosystem, and affect wave height. The reason that we're worried about this potentially is really the sort of knock-on effects. Will this change sediment transport patterns, which can change everything from habitats to how larvae are carried and settled, and eventually perhaps change water quality and perhaps even marine food webs. Now currently, as most of you probably know, there are small numbers of devices in the ocean, and the kinds of changes we would expect are too small to measure from those devices in the ocean because it falls well within the natural variability of the system. So most of what we know about potential changes in oceanographic systems from MRE comes from numerical models, computer models. And in order to show changes, those models must look at very large arrays. In many cases, probably larger than would ever be allowed in an area for other reasons, hundreds to perhaps thousands of turbines and WECs. So we feel that for the number of devices in the water at the moment, 1, 2, 3, 4 devices, there really is not a risk here. It's very, very low. It is important to note that the vast majority of the models, in fact, I'd say pretty much all of them, still need validation data. They are theoretical at this point, simulations. So we really do need to continue to improve upon these models, but get field data as we get to larger arrays. And it's important to share what we know. So this is considered a very low risk at this point. Now, the concept of Encounters with mooring lines and cables, potentially entangling or entrapping large animals, particularly large marine mammals like whales, perhaps basking sharks, etc. This has been raised many times by stakeholders, and the concerns really come from the concept that fishing gear, lost fishing gear, can be a real risk to large whales and other marine mammals, because we do find marine mammals dead with fishing gear tied around them. They're likely have been kept from feeding properly, perhaps drowned. Other concerns come from the early deployment of submarine cables way, like close to 100 years ago. These cables were laid with a great deal of slack, and we do know that some whales were entangled and killed that way. However, it's important to note the difference between marine renewable devices and fishing gear and those way long ago cables. There are not loose ends to marine renewable energy lines or cables, and the mooring lines are never loose enough, even with catenary moorings, to form a loop. Where there has been some concern raised has been draped cables between devices. But some work that's been done, both from a modeling perspective and observationally, indicates this is really a very low risk. And that's partly based on marine mammals' capabilities, and it's also based largely on the fact there really isn't a way to form a loop or a loose end. So what we believe has to happen here to really make stakeholders feel better about this is to increase the sharing of information, perhaps do some more modeling. Okay, those are the chapters associated with these stressor-receptor interactions. We also have a chapter on social and economic interactions, but particularly pointed at the kinds of data that need to be collected in order to consent or permit a project from a social and economic point of view. Every country that we have looked at requires some background on social and economic conditions in the project area, and also to understand what projected effects of the project might be. Yet there is very little guidance on how these data should be collected, what data should be collected. But the sort of social data that is needed are, if you put a development in a small area where there's been little population and suddenly there's an influx of industry and maintenance and so on, what are the effects on schools and social services and cultural areas? Economically, how is employment and wages and regional businesses and infrastructure likely to be affected? And so what this chapter does is try to provide some insight on what kind of data should be collected. But beyond that, we've made recommendations through a series of workshops and experts that we need to do more than just know what data to collect. But there's a need to track these data at the project scale, and this is likely to fall on the developers themselves. But it's also really important that this be tracked at a regional and national scale, and that has to fall to governments from municipal, regional, national, because there are a lot of thoughts and claims about how this will affect social and economic conditions. And unless we track these data in a fairly systematic but not too costly fashion, we're not really going to know. So that's what that chapter gets into. Now we're moving into the next section of this report that's dealing with environmental monitoring. This particular chapter, Dan Hasselman of FORCE, led this chapter with a whole lot of experts, as you can see there along the bottom, really trying to look at methods for studying animals interacting with tidal turbines. And this is very specific to this for a reason. This collision risk and interaction of animals with turbines continues to be the toughest risk we are investigating. And that is because these waters are very fast flowing. They are often not very clear. And it's really difficult to find an analog to this idea of collision risk or interaction and animals being affected in one way or another with turbines. There really isn't an analog. Conventional hydro turbines really don't work as good analogs for tidal turbines because of the difference in speed, the fact that a conventional hydro dam only lets fish out through the turbine, whereas in the marine environment, animals can swim around turbines. And ship propellers are really very different in how they may affect animals, both in the fact that they aren't stationary and they are moving much, much faster. So we really have had to examine this risk from scratch. Just some of the highlights, and this is a very meaty chapter, so I can't say too much about it here, but the sensors and platforms that we deal with are we look for passive acoustics, hydrophones for listening for vocalizing marine mammals and also getting a sense of the soundscape underwater. We use active acoustics a great deal. These are various types of sonars, if you will, single beam, multi-beam acoustic cameras to be able to visualize marine animals and the turbine and those interactions. We use optical, video, and still cameras, which are tricky in these waters, but are the only way to really get a sense of what species we might be dealing with and what those interactions look like close up. In many cases, those need underwater lights, which can change animal behavior, so that's a tricky one there. And in many cases, these are put together in integrated platforms with a data acquisition system. That's kind of the ideal, and this chapter goes through the 4 or 5 that are existent in the world and some of the success they've had in doing this. Of course, the challenges I mentioned, these are often turbid waters for the cameras. Biofouling becomes a problem when you put these sensor systems down, particularly around the optical cameras. When we start taking particularly video data, but even acoustic camera, active acoustic data, we build up a huge amount of data and so-called data mortgages. How do we deal with this much data? How do we manage the power around this if there isn't cable powered from shore, but we're running on battery banks? So there's a lot of challenges here that this group of scientists that wrote this chapter and many more around the world are dealing with. So that's a fun one. And there's extra supplementary information that didn't make it into the chapter just because there is so much. Okay, moving into the next section of the report, this is really dealing with these planning and management tools. The first is marine spatial planning and how this can assist with marine renewable energy development, written by Anne-Marie O'Hagan out of Ireland. Marine spatial planning is a process for balancing the needs of ocean users and ocean uses so that you can optimize both the environmental, social, and economic interests and outcomes. Marine spatial planning is usually based on collecting geospatial data on resources, marine resources, living resources, energy resources, and so on, and the uses to which they are being put. And for the purposes of this chapter, as she did in 2016, Anne-Marie surveyed the ocean energy system environmental nations on their MSP programs. And what she found was that marine spatial planning applications really vary country to country. They also sometimes vary within countries. And we have some countries in OES-Environmental that have full-on use of marine spatial planning involving marine renewables. This is occurring a good deal in Europe. We have other countries that are really applying MSP principles but don't have formal programs, and some countries where this has not really been taken up yet. And there's a series of recommendations of how this might be helpful. The next chapter deals with adaptive management and really how adaptive management can be applied to consenting or permitting marine renewables. Now, adaptive management is a process that sometimes called learning by doing. The idea that you assess a problem, you design and put out some kind of device, in this case marine renewables, and you monitor to see if the expected results are occurring, the expected effects. And with those monitoring data in mind, you can evaluate and adjust your monitoring programs, other kinds of management programs, even mitigation if there is mitigation required. And this is this little diagram on the right, the idea that you do this on an iterative basis. This is not just trial and error, though. It's a structured, iterative process. And the point is to reduce scientific uncertainty and improve the management decisions and outcomes. And we have had quite a number of marine renewable energy projects moved forward worldwide based on having an adaptive management process involved. And this really requires that the developer, the project proponents, the governmental agencies responsible, and other interested stakeholders hang in through the whole life of the project, looking at monitoring data, sometimes having to increase monitoring in certain areas to get better resolution and decrease uncertainty. In other areas, there's the potential to decrease the amount of monitoring once there is much more certainty. So this is a process that's been used in a number of industries, number of natural resource management sectors, and it's proving really quite useful and adaptive in marine renewables, and Sylvia Deleuve wrote this out of Ireland. Very good. So this chapter deals with, Chapter 13 deals with risk retirement. And this is a term that has been used in the industry but really had no real definition. And this is very much a product of OES-Environmental moving forward. And the idea here is we apply information from already consented projects to new projects, so that we look at certain of the stressors and with the purpose of trying to decrease the data collection burden on developers and decrease uncertainty. So we have looked at interactions that we believe to cause little risk and described how the existing information can be applied to new projects. We've looked at those consented projects and what data sets are available. We look to analogous industries that can help provide more insight as well as research projects. But it's important to note this doesn't replace or change any regulatory process. It's simply trying to make information more readily available. We've developed a process we call data transferability, of trying to systematically evaluate data sets from other projects, consented projects, or perhaps research studies, and bring them into consenting processes that are moving forward now. At this stage, we have moved forward looking at, for small numbers of marine renewable energy devices, 1, 2, or 3 WECs or turbines, and through a process of workshops and expert consultation, we have considered underwater noise and electromagnetic fields are probably ready for risk retirement for 1 to 2 devices. Now, what does this mean? It means that if a developer were to go forward with a proposal in some country, in some appropriate location, for 1 or 2 devices, that perhaps there does not need to be a great deal of monitoring for underwater sound or EMF. However, with certain caveats, we need to know what the sound output from new types of devices looks like. We need to know what the EMF, the power level carried through certain configurations of cables will be. This really is an attempt to try to move towards I hate to use the word standardization, but doing things in a more standard manner so that each study doesn't have to be redone at each new site. Okay, the final chapter of the report is just a summary and sort of a path forward. And we summarize what's gone before in the enormous report, and we really try to bring it together to say what are some principles that will help us move forward in moving this low carbon energy source forward without doing damage. And the first principle really is around the data collection that is requested for consenting or permitting really needs to be proportionate to the risk to the marine environment. There is a need to have sufficient evidence of the risk or likely risk that regulators really can rely on, that they don't need to go back to the drawing board for every new development. We are encouraging the transfer of data and information from consented projects and other studies, and trying to move towards retiring risks that aren't significant. And this really will allow greater focus and resources on those risks that are still significant. However, at this point, we really are talking about the small numbers of devices that are in the water, and we may very well have to revisit these risks for larger arrays. Okay, so that's really the quick gallop through the report. Before I go on here, I just want to remind you, if you have questions, please put them in the chat box and address them to all panelists, and feel free to go ahead with that at any time. So just to remind you, there is additional supplementary material on Tethys with a more detailed explanation, some longer versions of some chapters that were truncated for the report. The executive summaries up there, so are those two-page short science summaries. And all of this is hosted on Tethys. And if you're not familiar with Tethys, this is our knowledge base that was developed and is maintained at Pacific Northwest National Lab. It's a knowledge base that has over 6,300 scientific papers. It has gray literature reports and other documents. It does include information on land-based and offshore wind, but there is a very significant collection just for marine energy. There's also a lot more of the OES-Environmental information there. In addition to this knowledge base, which is essentially a large searchable database, there are also the information is searchable on a map viewer by geography. Tethys Blast is our bi-weekly e-newsletter that goes out that tells you about new things that have appeared on Tethys, also has a news and events section, talks about funding opportunities, sometimes job opportunities, etc. Tethys stories, an event calendar, some of the other information that's all housed there. And if you're not familiar, there's the URL right there. It's just tethys.pnnl.gov. And on the top crawl, in the upper right-hand side, it'll take you directly to the State of the Science report. And all these various pieces I've talked about, including the supplemental information, executive summary, et cetera. Okay, as I end up here, what I want to do is just say I'm up here talking today, and Leneg's and my name is on this presentation, but it truly takes an enormous village to put a report like this together. There's our PNNL team, from most senior to more junior, who have been really instrumental in doing this work. But also, here are the 30 authors of the chapters, and I can't say enough good things about this group of people's both expertise and experience in this field, but their level of professionalism and their willingness to really pitch in and put this report together sort of for the good of the overall marine renewable community. So really the kudos go to them for getting this to this point. And so I think that's all I have to say. Oh, except we do have these webinars coming up. Next week we will have a webinar at this same time that will delve into a great deal more detail than just the surface I've brushed here today. We will address 5 of the key chapters in much more depth next week: underwater noise, electromagnetic fields, changes in habitat, oceanographic systems, and mooring entanglement, and you will hear from the authors of those chapters rather than me. And the following week, on June 22nd, same time, we will have a full webinar on collision risk with the authors for marine mammals, seabirds, and fish, and also for the environmental monitoring technologies chapter. So you'll get to hear a great deal more about that. The report, of course, as I mentioned, was issued this week. We are taking public comment through August 10th, and that information will go to the Tethys email that's in the report, and the final release of this will be in September. And I think that's it. I hope you will dial in. We are repeating this very same webinar today, about 8 hours from now, which will really be able to focus on the Asian and Australian markets for their time zone. But if you care to dial in, feel free. And the information is also on Tethys. Okay, with that, I want to thank you very much for your time here today. And really, thank you for being involved. I see we do have some questions that I'm going to try to answer here, and you can still go ahead and put those questions in. So, to let you know that there will be, this webinar has been recorded along with the audio and the slides, and it will be up on Tethys in another week or so. So if you weren't able to hear or last through the whole thing or would like to refer to colleagues, so please do that. Okay, so moving into some questions here. We have a question as to whether there are monitoring requirements that have been set up that all projects should follow. For example, all projects that involve pile driving should do passive and acoustic monitoring. It's a great question, and unfortunately, we don't have any standard sets of monitoring requirements. Part of what we would like to do with the state of science is understand what really needs to be monitored and perhaps to move towards that sort of standard monitoring set of requirements. If not requirements, at least some recommendations. And there are projects going on in the U.S. and in other parts of the world that are trying to really do sort of cook-offs between monitoring techniques to understand what are the most efficient. And at that point, we hope that the outcomes of those kinds of projects will be shared internationally and make it possible for regulators to have sort of a menu to choose among. Whether we will get to extremely standardized sets of requirements anytime soon is not that clear. It's also really important to note that regulators in every country need to be free to make requirements that fit their regulatory needs. And I don't think we're arrogant enough to think that any of us can make all that standardized, but hopefully we'll get a little more common kinds of requirements. Okay, here's another great question. Have you addressed cumulative effects, including temporal effects? If not, do we plan to? Cumulative effects are one of those big looming questions we really haven't. As we move into phase 4 of OES-Environmental, assuming we are granted that phase, that is a key thing we would like to address. And cumulative effects is a really interesting term because different countries use that to mean different things. It could be simply, do we have multiple MRE developments in an area, you know, a set of 5 wave devices and a set of 10 more and a set of 100 more? Or are we also needing to look at all the background anthropogenic effects and how MRE might fit into those? And it's really that latter one, all the anthropogenic effects, that we are interested in. And temporal effects, of course, are a piece of that, both with animals, seasonal migrations, seasonal reproduction, and so on. It's extremely important to know when particularly construction windows occur, whether we are avoiding those most sensitive times of year, but also what happens if we have very small incremental effects, but over many, many years, for instance, in oceanography. This is something we really need to try to look at. And anyone who's ever tried to do cumulative effects work knows it's fairly tricky, but we really are going to try to do that. Okay, another question. Are your risk levels based on impacts due to small-scale pilot projects or based on commercial-scale larger projects? Great question. Thank you. At this point, we can only say anything very definitive for small-scale projects because that's what's in the water. Our modeling studies can allow us to project ahead to the larger arrays, but we really cannot assign those risk levels yet, except to say many of these risk interactions probably will need to be revisited when we get to larger arrays. We think some of them we can think, for example, say you are looking at underwater noise from 2 or 3 turbines. You can model what the noise would then look like from 30 turbines or 100 turbines. But in these very high energy waters, those models have a certain amount of uncertainty in them. So it may be necessary, even if you think you have a very good handle on the sound at the 3 turbine level, to perhaps go out and take additional data and carry out research at the larger level. There are other kinds of, to see if that is a cumulative effect, there are other types of interactions, for instance, collision risk. We may eventually really understand what the risk to say a dolphin swimming around a turbine may be. But what happens when the dolphin goes to the 2nd turbine or the 10th turbine or the 100th turbine? Are they regarding that as 100 different little sort of risk centers, or is there some kind of cumulative look to it? So it's a tricky question, but at this point we can only say definitive things about small numbers. Okay. Another question, are you assessing potential interference with marine science, including fisheries assessments? It's a great question, and as we try to think about some of these social and economic effects, fisheries is definitely one of the big concerns for marine renewables in two directions. Are marine renewable devices likely to interfere with ongoing fisheries practices and basically displace fisheries? That's the concern. The other one is, are fisheries activities likely to adversely affect marine renewables? For example, will it be necessary to have no-go zones around these larger MRE farms? We don't know. And or can lost fishing gear hang up on devices and cause problems that way? So these are things that are being talked about, again, in a somewhat theoretical manner because we don't have large numbers of devices out there just yet. But we do need to be looking at these. And it also becomes extremely important because there are stakeholders associated with every existing use at this point. And it's important to engage these stakeholders early and often so that marine renewables do not appear to be sort of the troubled kid on the block coming in. So we are trying to look at these. I will tell you that Ocean Energy Systems, OES, is interested in standing up tasks that are more focused on these other uses while we concentrate mostly on the environmental uses. Okay, are there any other questions I missed? Doria, do you see any others?
I think you got them all.
Okay, well, that's all the questions we've got at the moment. Oh, wait, no. Okay. This is sort of a statement and a question, I think. Marine renewables developed at scale, so large commercial scale, would require new statistical designs and survey methods for existing scientific survey operations. It's a really good point. As we are finding we need to adapt standard oceanographic equipment for surveys around marine renewable devices, and if you tune into the webinar in 2 weeks, you'll hear a good deal about this, trying to really understand how to work in these high energy waters. We are also going to have to look at how we analyze the data. If we have these multiple, say, sound sources or sources of collision or whatever out there, we do need to think about these differently than we have measuring standard oceanographic output. So yeah, it's a really good point. Another question here. Can these MRE areas provide increased biodiversity? This is a great question. We tend to focus, as I've often told by MRE developers, on all the potential negatives. But are there positives, other than climate change mitigation, et cetera, to MRE development? And there are a number of studies that have shown that if you put, say, anchors or foundations or lines out in areas of the ocean where there isn't much structure, you are, in fact, providing new habitat structure for a number of different organisms. And if you read Chapter 6 of the report on changes in habitat, you'll see that there's a good deal of work that's been done along these lines. There have been experiments done on, for example, imagine large foundations for wave devices or floating tidal that have different crevices put into them rather than just sort of a slab of concrete. And this has shown that you really can get additional biodiversity and organisms living in these areas, attracted to them and settling. There's a lot of information from underwater cables, especially from offshore wind and other industries, that show that different organisms may live on different parts of where a cable's been installed or a mattress has been put over a cable. So there's certainly the opportunity to increase the number of animals living in an area and potentially increase the biodiversity. One of the concerns about this is, could you be increasing invasive species? And it remains a pretty theoretical concern at this point, but you are providing a different kind of habitat. So these are questions that are going to continue to be asked moving forward. But I think it is very clear you can provide some, say, hard bottom habitat out in a very large area of soft bottom habitat in the oceans. Okay, I'm not seeing any others come in. Okay, so if that's all the questions, I would again like to thank you for spending your time with us today. We really appreciate it, and we hope you will go to the to Tethys. Let me just go back to that one, tethys.pnnl.gov, and on the upper crawl up next to the ORCA there on the right, you will get directly into the page that will take you to all these state of the science resources. And please consider joining us for these more in-depth webinars. We will probably have a third additional webinar a little later on some of the management and planning programs that I mentioned. But these two are scheduled right now, so I hope you will join us again. And with that, I will say thank you and give you the rest of your day back.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using AT&T Event Conferencing Enhanced. You may now